Beatrice, no, can you hear me?
There is a bit of echo, so I could hear something, but
Thierry, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Yeah.
Oh, hello, Thierry. Thanks for being with us. Thierry, just a change, if you will allow us, Bea would like to make her presentation first. Would it be fine for you?
That's okay, no problem. Do you want me to stop sharing then?
Yes.
Okay.
So Bea, you can be the first one. No, thank you very much as well. Thierry, you will follow. Thank you very much, Thierry, for making this tour for us. So if Bea can take the control. Excellent. I would like to, before Bea, you will start, to make an introduction, of course. Yes? About you. Please allow me 2 more minutes because more and more people are coming and joining us. Before I will make the introduction. Once more, let me thank both of you for being with us today. On a Saturday morning, we have millions of things to do, but you are here with us, and thanks to both of you. Please come in. We have for you as well. Θα το βλέπουν οι άνθρωποι. Δεν το βλέπουν. Ναι, να τους βάλουμε όμως μέσα σιγά σιγά. Δεν παίζουμε. Λοιπόν, κάνω kick-off, έτσι. Okay, so let me kick off, guys. Welcome to this session, which is the most important, of course, of the conference. We are thrilled to have with us 2 exceptional researchers, speakers, and mainly contributors of research in accounting and finance. We are going to start with Professor Beatriz Garcia-Osma, who is, of course, the editor-in-chief in the European Accounting Review, and professor of accounting in the University of Carlos III in Madrid. And she's also a research member of ECGI. Let me, first of all, introduce our speaker before I will give the floor to her. In addition to this, Beatriz Garcia-Osma, she is the visiting professor at the Stockholm School of Economics. She was an associate professor at the University Autónoma de Madrid. She holds a PhD in accounting and finance from Lancaster University in the UK. and she was also a Marie Curie pre- and postdoctoral researcher. Her research focuses on the links between financial reporting, corporate governance, and capital market. Beatrice has published in leading international journals, like the Accounting Review to start with, and she publishes actually every year in the leading academic journals in the area. She was elected to represent Spain in the board of the European Accounting Review between 2014 to 2020, and she's also a member of the European Accounting Association Management Committee from 2014 to 2017. As I highlighted to you, she's the editor of the European Accounting Review 2023 and the past editor of the Spanish Journal of Finance and Accounting. Without further more introduction, I would like to thank Bea for being with us. Let us clap here. And Bea, the floor is really yours.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for imposing this change that I misunderstood with the time difference, and I don't want to take time from Thierry's presentation. So I want to thank Dimitris, of course, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. He gave me a list of issues that I could talk about, but it was a very long list. So I'll try to talk about a few of these elements. And one of the things he said I should perhaps mention is a bit about the European Accounting Review. And just very briefly, because I don't want to take much time from you with this. We are an international scholarly journal, so this is the flagship journal of the European Accounting Association. So we publish around 5 issues per year, and we have somewhere in the region of 600 plus submissions. This is growing throughout my tenure. So when I started, we had something more like 400, and now we are, even now in December, we are nearly 700 now. So it's been increasing quite substantially. And I think this is a trend that, because that was also an issue that Dimitris wanted me to touch on, what are the trends that I see emerging also from being an editor in the journal. I would like to emphasize that because it is it has its name European, right? So maybe there's an idea that we only publish European papers, but that's not true. So it's fully it's European because it's the journal of the European Accounting Association, but it's an international journal and it's open to all paradigms, methods, styles of research. And maybe I can emphasize that we have 3 tracks which may be of interest. One is the Young Scholar track. So this is for job market papers, early stage academics, and what it means is not that the threshold for quality is at the threshold is always at the same place, but for early stage academics, editors know that the paper has been submitted by a young scholar, because when you submit, you click that you're a young scholar, someone who's on the tenure track, and therefore more guidance is provided. Even if it's a rejection, there will be more guidance provided to the submission. And hopefully, and also an opportunity perhaps to have more rounds of revision than would be given to other not in the young scholar track. We also have an open science track, which is for short papers, which are more methodological in nature, where there's an emphasis on sharing code and data with colleagues. And then we have a register report track, which is open throughout. So perhaps you are familiar with the Journal of Accounting Research that has made a number of calls, special issues for register report track. But European Accounting Review has a standing track, and at any point papers can be submitted to this track. So we allow for a choice of editor, and I have to say that in my experience, most authors do not choose an editor, but this is a possibility, choosing an editor. And later, if you're curious about this, I can tell you how many ask and what are the usual practice is to have 2 reviewers, and so the emphasis is on quality, and this means we have a very high test rejection rate. So we are now approaching 70% test rejection. It was more in the region of 50%, but of course as submissions have increased, also the test rejection has gone up, which of course is frustrating for authors when you submit your paper and it's back to your desk in a 2-3 days time. But it also means that if it's not back, it's because it has been a filter, and chances of the paper doing well are much higher. So we've imposed this very strict threshold on test rejection, precisely to try not to make anyone lose time, reviewers, authors, and then hopefully that means also limited number of rounds of reviews, which on average is 2 rounds of reviews. So one large round of reviews where, and then a second round where potentially just for tackling minor issues, unless something major has come in this first round of reviews. And we're trying to eliminate this kind of reject, revise, resubmit, high risk, because that's the kind of thing that leads you into these 3-4 rounds of revisions. And then at some point, it might be very frustrating if the paper ends up being rejected. Now, what are the trends that I see in this literature? So we're going, unfortunately, I think, towards longer papers. So during my tenure, I've tried to cut on and impose a limit. This is ad hoc, of course, and if I tell authors just 45 pages, there may be pushback. Why 45, right? Why not 50? Why not 40? But we see, right, we benchmark ourselves with other fields in science, for the International Academy of Science. We see that they write in a very readable way, and even for non-experts, papers are accessible. While this may not be true always for accounting papers, which tend to be very technical and very, very lengthy. And so we also have very slow publication processes, a lot of rounds, months. Publishing may take somewhere in the region of 2 years if everything goes well. Also, trends that exist is that there's a greater number of journals, and I think for early stage people, there's confusion about which journals to target, what should I be reading, where should I be sending, particularly because there's been an increased pressure from institutions to publish in these journal citation report listed journals. And also concurrently, there's been a trend from some editorial journals to move their rankings up on these citation ranks. And so there's quite a bit of confusion of, should I aim for a top quartile, top decile in the journal citation reports? And maybe it's not a good journal, right? And this is something that eventually down the line is something that you even have to hide in your CV, right? That you have a number of these publications. Now in accounting, I think, and I've seen this has happened a lot. And also a move towards publishing in journals which are in areas close to accounting. So, and also perhaps an emphasis on quantity over quality, precisely linked to these very quantitative measures of tenure that impose maybe having 4 or 5 papers published in a, even I've seen in some cases where PhD students are asked to have published papers before they finish their PhD. Obviously, the kind of journal you're targeting will not be optimal, let's say, if you see this in position. So these are trends that exist. What do I think are emerging areas, right, in accounting, and perhaps topics that are worth looking into? I think there's an obvious one, which is this link to the non-financial information. So we have right now a second revolution. So we have the IFRS revolution, right, the internationalization and harmonization, standardization of accounting. But now we are in the midst of a second revolution, which is this non-financial revolution. And I think it's an area where there's plenty of opportunities because regulation is emerging. We still do not know what are the objective function of, what are the users, what are the decisions that they're supposed to make with this non-financial information. And once we know who is this information targeted at, and what decisions should this person be making with this information, what properties should this information have, right? And this is where accountants were experts. We can see, we know all these things about properties of accounting information from the conceptual framework, and all these other elements of assurance, right? What's the difference between auditing and assurance? What is the role of assurance? What should be assured? What can be assured? The process, the actual number. How do we think about materiality? How do we think about this connectivity, right? The link between what is reported and what is actually the performance. So I think that's an area where there is a lot of scope, and where accountants were very well positioned to make contributions to that field. Then, of course, the other clearly emerging area is with respect to the new data opportunities that are appearing with tools to look into narratives, other communication channels. So we can look into all these professional, non-professional communication channels, from social media, people in forums who are discussing. And again, it's data that now it's available. It's democratizing also a bit who can do research and who can do top research, because it's no longer about buying the databases, the big databases access. It's about going out and finding this data, which is oftentimes publicly available, can be downloaded and analyzed. And so there's clearly a lot of scope for doing research in this. And when I mean narratives, I also mean all kinds of media, right? Videos. There's a paper in JAR, I think it's 2022, sorry, where they look at the expansiveness of the CEO, right? To what extent are you, when you argue, do you move your hands a lot and do you use a lot of space in the presentation? And that is something visual, right? That you can assess by looking at the YouTube video of the conference call and assessing whether the CEO has this characteristic of being very expansive in using a lot of space or not. So I think the magnitude of opportunities that exist and in links with other fields and other theory in psychology, finance, behavioral, I think really the potential is very large. Then of course, I think where we sometimes fail accountants, and this is part of our DNA in a way, is that perhaps because we are very interested in issues that have to do with measurement. And so we want to dedicate a lot of time to thinking about conservatism and to what extent are numbers conditionally conservative or unconditionally conservative. This has very limited potential for being of great interest to people outside of the field of accounting, right? And here's where I would say we need to, and this is great, this kind of research, and I do it myself, right, on the properties of accounting numbers and the details. But I do think that we have a comparative advantage, and we can use our skills in measurement, accountability, performance assessment in a number of real life issues that are emerging, like climate change, diversity, modern slavery. How do we measure these issues? It's very important for policy and for regulators to have a good measures of all these elements so that we can produce or tackle those issues from a policy standpoint. So that's areas where I think there's opportunities. And in this line, I would just like to give you two examples of what I mean about exploiting novel settings and data with our accounting background. And so, for example, one is this Fisban et al. Paper 2020 in Science. This is the best paper I've read, which doesn't know it's an accounting paper, but it is an accounting paper. And the paper is about behavioral nudges and how they reduce failure to appear for court. So one of the things that happens in the US, which is a highly litigious environment, is that very small things like drinking in a park might get you a citation for court, and then you get a ticket. And of course, people that get this kind of citation, they're drunk when they get the citation, they fail to appear for the court citation. And when you fail to appear for the court citation, this means now you have a police record, right? And you're in contempt of court. And it has very serious consequences for the rest of your life. About 50% of people fail to appear before court. And so these people, what they did was it's a field experiment. So of course, it's something that's a field study with a number of experiments attached to it. But what they do is purely an accounting issue, presentation of information. And so they say, this used to be the ticket. And when you get this kind of ticket, particularly if you are not a person that has a lot of information or training, what you get is complaint information, all these details. So it used to be right on the back of the ticket that you need to appear in court, right? And so they, with a connection to the police of New York, they redesigned the ticket. Another ticket is called criminal court appearance ticket. And they put the information in slightly different ways, but this is IFRS 1. This is about presentation of financial information. This is strictly something where accountants, we have a great advantage in thinking how should information be presented to different users so that we can impact on real decisions they make. The second example is it's also an accounting paper, but they know that it is an accounting paper. So it's the Bayer et al. Paper, and this is published in JAR. This is how does carbon footprint information affect consumer choice, right? So this is a paper where what they do is they produce these information panels using, it's an experiment again, it's a field experiment. So I'm not saying these things are easy to do, of course, but in a setting of a field experiment, they provide information in different ways. In the same way of the seed brain experiment, they provide information about the carbon impact of the food that people are going to eat in a cafeteria. And then they give it in different ways, right? So maybe I give it to you in terms of number of percentage of your daily consumption of carbon would go if you eat this food versus if you eat the other food is only 8% if you eat the bad food, right? Your percentage is 43% of your carbon allowance for the day, or in terms of monetary, or in terms of grams of, and what would be potentially the best way to provide this information and nudge people into maybe picking the choice in the cafeteria that has the lowest carbon impact, right? Lowest the carbon footprint. So this is and probably some people in the audience are thinking, what does that have to do with accounting, right? But this is where I'm saying that our accounting skills and what we know about measurement, presentation, information, objective function of users, decision making, and how information links to the decisions that users are making, and how properties of that information, which also have to do, because we're always doing earnings management, impression management, is the same thing. This is about how do you use that knowledge that we have, but in the sense of trying to understand, can we nudge or can we help people? Because here you might say, well, I don't know if I end up choosing the linguine instead of the salad, is the world a better world, right? I don't know. But in the case, for example, of the ticket, if you can, with this intervention, just by changing how the information is presented, you can reduce, and they find nearly by 10% the number of people that show at court. So they reduce this failure to appear for court. This is a massive thing. It's a life changer for many people, right? So it's what I'm saying, linking our accounting knowledge in terms of what we work typically on and what the skills are, to perhaps novel settings where maybe there's opportunities for substantial impact. Now, the other thing that Denise is also asking me about is how do we think about the quality of our papers, and how do we try to improve, right, the quality of our work? And I think one of the major issues that we all face is starting projects. So this is the key decision, right? When you decide to start a project, and sometimes we're eager to start too many projects, and sometimes perhaps also for junior faculty, it's hard to say no. And once you say yes to a project, as I said, this may take 3-4 years of your time and end up being maybe a minor paper with not a substantial contribution, and you end up working a lot on that project. And perhaps it's the advice for finding or the way to think about your own research is in the end, and what is the contribution that is inherent to the research question, right? If the research question has very limited scope for contribution, you can squeeze it in 1,000 ways and you can run a lot of analysis, but you end up going back to the research question has been studied, and we don't learn a lot from this research question. So I like this paper, this Ellison paper, because she explains this very clearly, and she calls the Q of the study, which is the contribution that is at the core of the research question. And in my experience, if the paper has an interesting research question, this goes a long way with reviewers, and it builds you a lot of goodwill with the editor as well. And oftentimes what we dedicate is a lot of time to other parts of the paper. So it's very important that there is a clear motivation, right? Why is this interesting? And is there tension? Should I keep reading? Because maybe no one has done this, but it's obvious that the answer is yes or no. So clarifying why the answer is not obvious. And in this, of course, oftentimes what we come up with is an explanation for why there should be no effect. So we say, if I improve board independence, accounting quality should be higher. And then, because we want to create some tension, then we come up with some stories why perhaps there is no effect. That is kind of a straw man tension. So the real tension comes from having strong arguments for why the effect should be the opposite, why board independence will reduce financial reporting quality. That's the kind of tension that has potential for being interesting to people if you make a strong argument or the opposite finding, right? And then, of course, contribution, which is how does this add to what we already know in terms of theory, right? Can we challenge what we think we know? I encourage people to read papers, particularly the early bits where the logic is being set up, because there's always assumptions, right? And sometimes these assumptions are bypassed in a way by the authors, and they are not built on prior literature. And so that creates opportunities for taking a step back and looking at the assumptions that the paper is making, trying to find interesting questions, which was perhaps another question that also Dimitri mentioned of how do I find questions. I try to think what are the key assumptions, right? What are the identifying assumptions in this paper, and do they hold? And can I find prior research that actually documents that this is true? Or would it be interesting to actually look at this, right? And of course, the theory. So these are so it's the research question that builds the paper, right? To what extent is it interesting, has tension to it, and it potentially has a contribution. And then we have what Ellison calls the R quality, which is very important, right? We have to have methodological rigor. We have to have good data. We have to do a good literature review. The statistical analysis to be right, the interpretation, etc. Now, potentially we should dedicate a lot of time to the Q and less to the R, but the trend is that we're dedicating increasingly more time to the R than to the Q, right? And as an editor, I think the Q is a fatal flaw. You can have a great paper, 80 pages, 3 online appendixes, all the robustness analysis that you can think of, and you get a letter of rejection saying, we don't think it has enough contribution, right? So most effort should be dedicated at the beginning of the project, not, oh, I have an idea, let me run some analysis. Oh, this seems to make sense. Let's do a lot of work on this. And you end up with something that's very minor contribution. So I would say, in terms of selecting our projects and research projects, it's very important that we think very hard about the research question and then decide whether it's worth engaging in that, particularly given that it takes so long to publish in accounting. I mean, in terms of the methodological rigor, I hate to say here it's maybe fixable. So increasingly, I think, particularly if you are an empiricist, identification and causal links have to be established in the paper. At least you have to address that. So that may be also non-fixable. But definitely all these other things about statistical analysis, literature review, robustness, additional tests, this is the kind of things that can easily be fixed in a review, and it's unlikely to get you rejected because yes, the reviewer can suggest another analysis, and you can always do that. So one of my papers, for example, in AOS, in Accounting Organization and Society, I remember the letter we got from the editor was, I really like the idea you have here, but you have to redo it entirely. And we did, because it was Accounting Organization and Society, right? So we collected the data again for a different setting completely, and then we rerun everything. But that's also up to the author, right? Whether you think I will do this because I want to publish in this journal, or I will send the paper elsewhere. That's of course. But I think in terms of the distributions of what we should dedicate, what we see is that there is a bit of a gap, because we dedicate little to creating the Q and a lot to creating the R. And so there's this gap, right, in terms of where our time is spent. And so it's maybe worth not doing so much analysis. And I'm talking as an empiricist. And that brings me to data, right? Because of course, for empiricists, this is an issue. And so we make a lot of decisions as empiricists, and this is where that's also why and I think that's perhaps less of a problem for people like me, because I work with CompuStat data, CRISP data that's publicly available, and so my studies can be replicated, right? But it is a concern, particularly when you are now, as I said, in a world where you will collect your own data, and so register reports, even if you are an empiricist, making these decisions of what analysis you're going to do and ex ante makes sense. So the decisions will have biases, right? And so there's publication bias, there's these biases that we'll have looking for significant results. But what it means is that a lot of the times papers do not replicate. And 10 years from now, we don't want our paper to be in a summary of, hey, these are all the papers that do not replicate, and you have 3 in that list, right? So this is an interesting paper if you want to look at it, from Proceedings of the National Academy of Science 2022. And what they did is also is interesting, because what they did was they gave, so it's from Bresnau, Rinke, Wutze, and Soltag, they gave 73 teams the same data, and they asked them to test the same hypothesis, but not how, right? So they give you the data, and they tell you, ask these out of the question, right? Whether migrants actually influence efficiency, or just one big question, right? What they found is that the distribution of whether the answer was yes or no, you can see it here, right? So wildly various results for the same hypothesis to be tested with the same data. So it's just a data set that they give you. And so the answer was negative and 25.4%, strongly negative in some cases, positive in about 16.9%, and then somewhere, right, neither one or the other in about 57.7%. So what factors explain this variance in the results, right? So some of it could be explained by researcher decisions that were explicit in the papers, right, that you could track. So measurement, sample selection, model specification, model ranking. Other were elements that could also be explained, not just explicitly, but if you run an analysis, right, you take what did they find, and then I take researcher characteristics, method expertise, topic expertise, prior beliefs. You could explain, right, some of these variants. But that still gives you the unexplained bit, which is very so I think this is a concern for empirical research, the fact that a lot of studies do not replicate, that we all as empirical researchers, I don't think anyone in the audience who's an empiricist is, maybe you are shocked by distribution slightly, and maybe your priors were, if I give the same data and hypothesis to test to 73 different teams, the variance will be small. There will be variance. I think we would all agree with this. The variance will be smaller. Maybe it is the case where it doesn't generalize. I don't know. But I do think that this is a concern that we need to keep in mind, right? That when we run our studies, we want them to replicate, because I think that this replication crisis that we've seen in psychology, in other fields, it also exists in accounting. Not so much, as I said, work that builds on this publicly US data, which is available, because that can be downloaded, and I would say a reasonable number of papers do replicate. But this is a concern in terms of what are the implicit assumptions, or the assumptions that we're making, the choices that we are making in running our analysis, which we do not explain in our papers, right? So they mean that our papers do not replicate, and it may be for good reasons, right? So, of course, as I was saying, there is a role for, and I think in this conference, I think the Greek setting is probably quite similar to the Spanish setting, and for a lot of my alarm is ringing, so I'll just finish with this and stop here, so I don't take time from Thierry's presentation. But we are at the data disadvantage, right? In a lot of public universities in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in many countries where the public system doesn't offer a lot of financing. So it's challenging to compete without access to these words, databases, etc. Right? And there's low incentive to share. Right? Why would someone share? It's even forbidden sometimes by contract. But I do think that manual data collection is coming, and that this will be a field equalizer. So it lowers a bit, right? This possible. Of course, they still have, like, the professor in a top university in the US might have 5 research assistants, but still, I think the access to interesting questions, at least, is equalized by this access that I was mentioning to these areas where the people with a lot of resources might not have an advantage, and it's worth maybe investing in these areas. Of course, when the data is not standard and it's not well known, there's high concern over the quality of that data, and bigger efforts have to be made by the researchers to provide assurance. Because I think from an editor's perspective, reproducibility must be ensured. So I would encourage people to share the code, the data. I know that when you run code from someone else in your own machine, sometimes there's errors. Maybe you try to run your own code for 6 years ago, and it's not. So there's need to protect our future person, right? Think of you in 10 years' time. And this is not that you want to be ethical now or nice or share with people. It's even if you want to be egoist and protect yourself, right? Your reputation 10 years from now. It's important that you keep your own data safe, that you perhaps use this kind of GitHub or other tools that exist to freeze in time your analysis. This is the data I had, this is the code I had, and when I ran it, this is what I obtained. And at least, and someone can tell you, well, your theory was wrong, but that's okay. That's not a problem. That's how the field advanced. I also want to say that exciting data does not mean contribution. I've emphasized a lot novel data and exciting data, but it doesn't immediately mean contribution. So we still need to think back and say, you know, is there a research question here that I have, and should I go look for the data? Because reverse engineering interesting questions into data is not easy. And in top journals, I think it's very hard to write. You have to be very good to reverse engineer an interesting question from your data and results. And of course, you need to know your data, do all the manual checks. And so I think I will stop here because I don't want to take more than my allocated time. I think I've touched on a few of the elements that Dimitri told me to discuss. And I don't know if because I need to apologize to the audience because I misunderstood the time difference. And so unfortunately, I need to leave in about 15 minutes and I cannot stay for Thierry's presentation. I also apologize to him. So I don't know if you prefer to have now some questions.
So, Bea,
thank you, and I apologize.
Thank you very much for your insightful and full of information presentation. Of course, needless to say that the room is full over here. So I will give to the audience the floor to make questions to Professor Garcia Osma. So please raise your hands if you would like to ask something or anything regarding accounting, mainly and research in the European Accounting Review.
Bea, this is Andreas. Okay, you have been doing a great job.
Hello, Andreas.
As far as European Accounting Review is concerned, we're very proud. I remember European Accounting Review when it started several years ago. And when we compare, you know, what's going on nowadays, it's one of the leading journals, not only in accounting, but in finance, and you have been doing a great job. And since here we have a number of even PhDs and new colleagues, it's very interesting to understand that in order to publish in a leading journal like European Accounting Review, and needless to say about Journal of Finance, is not only, you know, to spend tremendous time, as you mentioned, on methodology and retrieving the data and using data from CRISP or CompuStat, but at the same time, you know, have a novel idea, okay, and have, you know, nice motivation and nice contribution, but this should be based to a great extent on a theoretical framework. And I believe novel idea, you know, plays a very important role as far as the contribution is concerned. So what I would suggest, you know, to new faculty members and to PhD students, as Bea said earlier, spend tremendous time, you know, on economic intuition. This study that you're doing right now, does it have contribution to the accounting or finance literature or not? If it does not, you may not be able, or don't proceed further because it may be difficult to be published, in top journals or in leading journals, okay? And I remember last year, excellent presentations from here as well. You were not here, Bea, by Manthos Delis and George Panos. They made excellent presentation, both of them, and I was here. And what they stress, both of them, is that, especially for young faculty members, try to get, your own data, right, Yorgos? And they gave us, different type of sources when we can get, this kind of data. These are unique type of data, and it's going to be easier for us, to contribute. Another thing, since here, in the audience, the majority of us are Greeks, okay? A lot of us we're doing, research as far as, Greek data is concerned. And we want your opinion as far as that is concerned. Some of us, or some PhD students, some young faculty members, what they are doing is that they are trying to get Greek data and they replicate a US study. That's what usually happens. What's the future of those kind of studies? Can they be published in those kind of leading journals like European Accounting Review? Or what else should we do? Or what else should young faculty members and PhD students do in order to have greater chances to publish their paper in leading journals like European Accounting Review? Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. I mean, I think you've mentioned a few issues, but starting from the last one, replications of prior research using local data are not very well received. It is not because it's not important to have replications, which I do think that we need replications, but it's because oftentimes the paper doesn't have anything new to add. So I read a lot of these papers, and maybe they have a theory, they developed it, and they build on prior research, and they explain what the prior research has done, and then they come to the same hypothesis as prior research. And then they just say, but we're using it with this new data set, but it's not clear that that represents a substantial contribution. So to me, if the paper is a pure replication and it has no novel theory or new logic, new mechanisms, it's very difficult to get those papers at a leading journal. Of course, we have to think that a lot of the top journals are not international journals. They are regional in the sense of the US journal. We think of US journals as JAR, TAR, JAE as being international because we all target those journals, but they are US-based studies. They are US-based and they are edited, some of them by like JAR is edited by University of Chicago. So they have their local interest. And hitting these journals with data from Greece or Spain, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because also they don't have this international flavor, right? Where European Accounting Review would have this interest, of course, because it's an international journal. I think we need to understand that. Does that mean you cannot publish with Greek data? No, not at all. And if you go through these top journals, you see, and I encourage you to look for these papers, right? Like the UK-based, the Greek-based, you see these papers coming through in the top journals, and see how they're written, right? And you will see that they hide the fact that this is Greek data for a bit of time. So they would not say the case of Greece in the title, for sure. And they would not discuss potentially that this is exclusively a Greek setting until a bit later, right? So they introduce the topic, they say this is a new idea, and then at some point when they say, I test my hypothesis using Greek data. But at that point, you have the interest of the reviewer and the editor, because this is a new study, this is a new idea, and so we all have biases. And I think if you title your paper, blah, 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 the case of Greece, you are decreasing your chances of getting through. This is this is an opinion from my own perspective, and I think, and also from seeing in a way papers that do get through, that use very small narrow settings, that they do not emphasize the setting but they emphasize the theory and they emphasize the question. Now, for PhD students working, I think in terms of having a job market paper, it's always best if it's a single author paper, which is, I think, increasingly true. I know the culture in Greece is the same as in Spain. It's typical to have your supervisors in the paper, and that is also okay. I think people in Europe, when they're hiring, they know what universities you come from or what the culture is. But to the extent that it can be a single author paper, it's always best. And definitely, I think we as PhD students, it's easy to get overly excited about data and as I said, it's very difficult to reverse engineer a good research question from results. So the first thing is to have a strong research question. And this is advice that I've heard from other people, so it's not my own advice. But for example, one of the things, Philip Brown, right? I had the opportunity to have a seminar with him when I was doing my PhD at Lancaster. And he mentioned that there's 3 things we can do to try to look for ideas. So when you read a paper, and as a PhD student, typically you read a paper and you think the paper is wonderful, right? It's hard to find problems with the paper. But try to ask 3 systematic questions about this paper, which is what would I have done differently, right? That's one question. And that immediately may give you some ideas, right, of what could be other things that could be done. It's a small contribution type of question, but it's one step. What would I have done differently? The second type of question you can ask yourself is, what is an alternative explanation for this finding? And so if you can think of an alternative explanation to that finding, because you know the institutions and you know the setting, and you can think, no, these guys got this finding, but I can think of a mechanism that can explain this, and that is entirely different. That gives you a nice paper again. And the third question would be the what's next type of question, right? If I accept that this is a great paper, I wouldn't have done a single thing differently. I cannot think of a single alternative explanation to this. And I believe their findings. What does that mean, right? How can I build on this to actually come up with a new step, right? If I believe that this is true, how does it lead me to something different? So that is constructing new ideas from reading the literature. And that's narrow because you limit yourself to what's existing, right? The other way, of course, of finding topics is by being in the world and reading more broadly, right? So this Fishban paper, it opened, it's before the Bayer paper, but the Bayer paper is very similar. It's about presentational issues, right? So not reading only academic literature beyond our field, but also being in the world and thinking what are the big issues and what are the large questions that are unanswered and that are currently under debate, and how can we contribute to that, to the extent that if you're a PhD student and you find a field that you're interested in and you delve into it, you get institutional knowledge about it and read a lot, you will have good ideas. So at least this was my experience in the sense of my own PhD process. I read and did not have a single idea for maybe a year and a half into my PhD. And then at some point, you accumulate all that knowledge that you have from reading papers, from going to the seminars, from listening to how more senior people think about research, and suddenly something clicks. And that's when you start to get ideas, right? So I would also tell people not to be frustrated if there's PhD students and they've been reading for a year or a year and a half or 2 years and they still struggle, because these ideas do come. So it's a question of keeping this process of thinking through papers that we read, looking at issues that are in the world, and then of course presenting our ideas to senior colleagues and give us advice.
Thank you very much, Bea. I don't know if there is any follow-up question from the audience before. Yes, we have from Professor of Affairs.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question. Many senior editors, most academics would recognize the value of interdisciplinary research because, you know, it draws on different bodies of knowledge. Yet in practice, we all push back because most of the time, interdisciplinary research will question some of the fundamental assumptions on which our own discipline is based. what is your view on interdisciplinary research as that relates to accounting? Thank you.
Yeah, I am, but I see how this is about editorial policies, and it may depend on the journal. Definitely, I think in European Accounting Review, we are quite open to this type of research. And if you look through any of our issues, you will see that this is true, because it is enriching. And the issue perhaps is that when people do this kind of research, then they do not target accounting journals. Because accounting journals, we have all experience with that they're slow, it takes time. And so when you have this kind of research, a lot of people, they target the other discipline, right? Interdisciplinary, there's few disciplines in that. And these papers end up elsewhere, not because accounting journals do not want them, but because the authors select themselves into sending to alternative outlets.
Excellent. Bea, thank you very much once more for your contribution in our conference. As a for your presentation today, we have a plaque for you. I don't know if you can see it. This, of course, will be sent to you in Spain in an address you will give to us. But really, please, all of us, let us thank.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and again, apologies to Thierry for jumping.
Period, which is coming, and a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you and your family there. Thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot, and this gives me the floor now to come to Thierry Foucault. First of all, thanking him for being so kind to give the floor to Professor Osma because he was in a hurry. Let me introduce you first of all, Thierry, and then of course I will give you all the floor. Professor Thierry Foucault is a professor of finance at HFAA in Paris and a research fellow of the Center of Economic Policy, the CEPR. He has a doctoral degree in finance from HFAA, Paris as well, and he has taught in various institutions, including the University Pompeu Fabra, Carnegie Mellon in the United States, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland, Said Business School in Oxford, Timbergen Institute in the Netherlands, etc., etc. His research focuses on the determinants of financial markets liquidity, the industrial organizations of these markets, and the effects of the real economy. He has published in all the leading academic journals that you can imagine in finance, including the Journal of Finance, Review of Financial Studies, Journal of Financial Economics, etc. He has received research awards for his research from the Europlus Institute of Finance, the HEC Foundation, the Analysis Group Award. He has got as well from the Western Finance Association awards. He serves or has served on the scientific committees of Autorité des Marchés Financiers, the Research Foundation of Banque de France, the Group of Economic Advisors of the Committee of Economic and Market Analysis of the European Securities and Market Authority, the ESMA, and was a member of the Executive Committee of the European Finance Association. He's currently the Associate Editor of the Journal of Finance, Editor-in-Chief, Co-Editor-in-Chief in Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis. He's Associate Editor as well in the Review of Financial Studies and the Review of Asset Pricing Studies. Just an indication of the quality of the research that Professor Foucault is doing. He has 3 forthcoming papers in the Journal of Finance, which is, I would say, something exceptional for every single academic. So congratulations for the Thierry. So without any further talk from me, once more, thank you very much for being with us here, and we are looking forward for your talk.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Is it okay?
It's very well, yes.
Okay, good. But thanks for giving me this opportunity to present my thoughts about the publication process in finance. So quickly, as you said, I got my PhD at HFAA Paris in 1994. I moved to Spain then to the US, and I was back at HFAA in 1998. And my research interests broadly define our market microstructure, real effects of financial markets, mainly, information production in financial markets and their effect on corporate investment. And over the last 5 years, I have been working a lot on the effect of big data and AI on financial markets and information production in these markets. I got a NRC grant from the EU to work on that. So I have been co-editor of various academic journals, more recently the GFQA, and I've been associate editor at the Journal of Finance since 2012. So I have seen in this in those positions, I have seen many papers. GFQA, I am in charge of about 200 papers per year. We receive something like 1,300 papers overall. We are five editors, and we split the workload among us. So I have seen and edited many papers. So let me share with you my thinking about the publication process. And here I'm going to share my thinking as editor, and I'm going to give some recommendations. And I must say I'm a bit schizophrenic because although I know as editor what I would like to see, what is the good paper from my viewpoint, I must say that as an author, I don't follow the recommendation I'm going to make. So no, it's a bit schizophrenic, and I know that this is one of the difficulties. I mean, people know what it takes, to get published in those journals, but sometimes, that's not sufficient. They don't implement, action, and I do that myself all the time. Okay, so here I'm going to overlap, my talk is going to overlap and recommendations overlap quite a bit with what Bea was saying, maybe in a slightly different way, but the message is almost the same. So she was talking about Q versus R quality, and I must say that this is very important. This is a very nice way, to explain the different dimensions that makes a paper publishable in a finance journal. So novelty is extremely important. Motivation is extremely important as well. So this is what Bea was calling the Q quality. And that's certainly a very important dimension. That is, authors need to convincingly argue that their paper is making an incremental contribution. That does not mean, that you are going to change the field. That's not what is expected, and most papers published in the top journals don't do that. But at least, it must be clear that you are moving the needle in some direction, so that you are bringing on the table a new idea, a new message, a new view on some economic mechanisms. You are changing, maybe the direction, what people were thinking about the direction of an effect, and you convincingly do so. So it's very important to explain right from the start in the paper what the paper does and the message of the paper is novel. And at the same time, you need to have a compelling motivation. That is, of course, you can find results which are new, but that are not significant enough to be published in the top journal. So novelty per se is not sufficient. The results must be significant and important as well for, let's say, the future of research. I mean, a good way, to ask to think about that is whether, for instance, the path of future research is going to be influenced by the results. So there is a good chance that the paper is going to have impact. And maybe whether the path, of policy, for instance, is going to be influenced by the results in the paper. Then a third important dimension is what I would call the scope of the paper. You should make sure in writing the paper that you don't talk only, to the few researchers in your area. That is, very often, in my rejection letters, I say that the paper is not sufficient for general interest journal like the GFQA. By that, what I mean, general interest means that the paper should at least be readable by people who are not directly experts in your field. Who are supposed, everybody, readers of the GFQA, typically they have a PhD in finance. They should be able, without too much difficulty, to understand any papers published in the GFQA. So that's the bar you should have in mind, when you write your paper. It should be written in such a way that it is not impenetrable, basically, by people who have sufficiently expertise in finance, let's say a PhD in finance. And then, of course, this is the R quality part that Bea was mentioning. The quality of execution must be there. That is, there must be no flaws in the execution of the paper, in the use of methodology, the methodologies, for instance, if this is an empirical paper. But that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Very often, authors are disappointed by rejection letters because referees do not point to mistakes in the paper. They point, to lack of contribution or insufficient contribution. Or sometimes, the referees give a list of to-do things, and those things are feasible by the authors. But the rejection is not coming from, and the authors tell me, I can revise the paper and address those points. This is true. Very often, this is true. The only thing is that very often, this is not the cause of rejection. The cause of rejection has to do with the first point here. So quality of execution is for sure a necessary condition. You cannot opt to get published, if there are flaws in the execution, but that's not sufficient. That's not sufficient. So that means, that when you write papers, it's very important to keep those things in mind, especially for the introduction. That is, you need to explain very carefully why your study is needed. That's the motivation part. Why people, will be interested in reading the results in the paper, and why it fills the gap in the literature. And here, the literature review is very important, but very often a mistake that I see is that people write too long literature reviews. They feel obliged to cover, all papers that have to do with what they do, maybe as an edge against, referees. But in doing that, what they forget is to explain clearly the difference between what they obtain and what the closest paper in the literature obtain. So for me, a good literature review is not a review which is exhaustive. That's not a survey. I mean, there are papers that just do that. That's a review that tells me exactly what is new in the paper compared to the closest papers. And so literature review should not be, let's say, more than 2 pages. 2 pages is already quite a lot. In the introduction, it's very important as well that the research question is clearly formulated. And maybe the best way is to literally ask a question. And what I like is when the question comes very early, let's say on the first page in the paper, so that we know exactly what is the target. There are papers that never define clearly the research question, or at least in a vague way. So in a sense, I have always the impression that when this is the case, authors are expecting referees and maybe the editors to define the question for them. That's for finance journals, that's really not a good strategy. Given the flow of papers, all the top journals, they get more than 1,400, 500 papers. So referees and editors are not going to spend time on thinking about how the paper could have been written, what is interesting in the paper. This is really to the authors to do that. And the goal of the referring process is not to improve the paper. The goal of the referring process is just to provide an assessment of whether the paper has the potential, given the novelty of the results, to go to a top journal. And then what are the things to do that? But certainly not, especially in case of a rejection, to tell authors, how they should write the paper. That's very consuming. You should think also about journals as having, limited resources in terms of time and money for referees and editors. And given the number of papers submitted to journals, there is just, that will not be a good allocation of resources to do that. Formulating clearly the research question is very, very important. And I think this is helpful for authors as well. If you cannot formulate the research question clearly in your mind and in the first page of the paper, that means that there is something a bit problematic with the paper. And then in the same vein, I think that formulating clearly the hypothesis, especially for an empirical paper, the testable hypothesis is very important. And I will say that should appear as well in the introduction quite early. And in the body of the paper, the hypothesis should be well justified in light of the theory, in light of economic mechanism. Sometimes what I see in empirical papers are people who state an hypothesis, X is going to have a positive effect on Y, and then they say, oh, by the way, we may get as well the opposite effect. X may get a negative effect on Y. I think that's not, if everything is possible, then you are not testing very carefully, I guess, the theory. I mean, the theory typically is very clear on the direction of the effect, or if the two effects are possible in the theory, that's not for the same set of parameters. So this is what I call testing the theory, that is really taking the theory seriously and say, okay, how am I going to detect when the effect predicted by theory should arise, and does it arise when the theory tells me it's going to arise? So For empirical papers, I think, for a top publication, this bar should be passed. That is, authors need to be very clear about how they test a particular mechanism, that means theory typically, and why, they reject the theory, or for which set of parameters they reject the theory. And all those things, I think, should be done early in the paper, in the introduction. And the introduction should not be too long. So that requires, spending time on writing the introduction is good time. That is, you have limited space, so you cannot put too many things in introduction. Every space is costly in a sense for you. So you should think very carefully about how you are going to address, the points on this slide in, let's say, no more than 5 pages. I think a good introduction is 5, maybe 6 pages, but no more. Because going more than that, again, you are consuming the time of referees and editors, the cognitive time. And very often people are going to form their impression and their first opinion on the paper just by reading the introduction. And then, reading the rest of the paper, of course, you may change their opinion. But as usual, when we form a prior, we need to get a lot of additional, conflicting information to change the prior. So really paying a lot of attention to the introduction and whether, it addresses those points is very important. The exposition is important as well. As Bea was mentioning, there is a trend, in having very long papers. That's a problem. As editors at GFQA, but that's the case in other journals, we try, to nudge authors in writing smaller papers when we invite revision. My experience is that shorter papers typically are better. They have more impact in a sense when you read them. Of course, that's difficult to do when you have, something big to say, because typically you need to develop the argument, you want to do robustness checks and so on and so forth. But try to discipline yourself to be as concise as possible. That requires rereading the papers many, many times, tracking, sentences which are not useful for understanding the paper and so on and so forth. And something which is feasible, that was not feasible 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I began, is that now you have the possibility, journals give the possibility to authors to have internet appendices published with the paper. And I find that super useful, because that means that everything that has to do with extension and robustness checks, typically you can push to the internet appendix. And that's going to help you to shorten the paper a lot. There is no limit on the internet appendix. You can put whatever you want in the internet appendix. So I really encourage people to use that as a way to shorten their papers while still addressing, questions about robustness and so on and so forth. But of course, internet appendices, they should be written with the same discipline as for the paper. Something that I have seen as well is that sometimes, people mention results in internet appendices, but when you start reading the internet appendices, you realize that it's very difficult to read. That's a problem. I mean, the internet appendices should be written with the same rigor, same organization as the main body of the paper. Another thing is that it's very important to be, those papers, these are scientific papers. Science is about precision. So it's very important to write in a very precise and concrete way. Sometimes people make, especially in the introduction, make vague or very general statements. That's not very, typically that does not, help to be compelling precisely. It's much better if you are very precise in the use of names, about what you do, terminology, and also very concrete. By that, I mean, for instance, quantifying the effects in economic terms, giving figures, giving statistics, and so forth. Yeah, last thing, which I think when people submit their papers, they don't pay that much attention to the abstract. I think this is a mistake. Very often journals are going to require that abstracts are not more than 100 words. I think sticking to this requirement is a very good discipline, because that forces authors to think about what is the main message of their paper. How can they convey the main message in 100 words, not more than that? That's very difficult to do, but forcing you to do that is very good to force you to think about the main message and the main point you want to make. And then writing the introduction becomes much simpler because in a sense, you can organize everything around this message. So in terms, of disciplining yourself, I think, forcing you to respect, this constraint of 100 words is very good. Okay, so in terms, Dimitrios asked me, to give some ideas about how to generate ideas. I think, for young scholars, what I would recommend a lot is to specialize. That is to build up expertise in one area. And so maybe people have the feeling that this is what they do during their PhD, but I don't think this is true. For me, for instance, it took me maybe 10 years just to really master the literature in market microstructure after my PhD and really understand the ideas, the concept, the question. So I think, you should really take time after your PhD to master the literature in the area to which you want to contribute. The reason is that then it becomes much easier to identify gaps in the literature. So you save a lot of time for ID generation because you don't have to read the literature anymore. You know it. And you know exactly, the nature of the questions, the way people address the questions, and where there are gaps in the literature. So that's one way to generate ideas, which is to know the literature and identify gaps in the literature. And that's much easier when you have really developed expertise in the literature. And then after that, you can start moving out of your area of expertise. And then I think another way to generate ideas is what I would call intellectual arbitrage. That is, use, techniques you have learned in your area of expertise to address questions in another area. For instance, in my case, I did that precisely. I was initially heavily specialized in the nitty-gritty details of the trading process. This is market microstructure. People tend to find that maybe a bit narrow sometimes. But then, basically, I use this knowledge to address relatively bigger questions in corporate finance. And what are the effects, of financial markets on corporate investment? Those are big questions. And for that, I use essentially my knowledge of, the way information gets into prices, how to test that, how to measure that. So that's what I call intellectual arbitrage. That's a very good way to generate ideas, I think. So these are all internal ways. I agree also with Bea that another very good way to generate ideas is to read, the financial press, the Financial Times, for instance, be on the top of policy debates, and so on and so forth. That's another very good way. It may be a little bit more difficult when you are a young scholar, because the risk then is that if you don't know exactly the literature, you may not have the right tools, to address, the hard policy questions, for instance. Okay, another thing which I think is very important, and I like to cite this guy, Henri Poincaré was a French mathematician in the 19th century. He's one of the brightest mathematicians of all time. And he said, science is built up of facts as houses with stones, but a collection of facts is no more science than a heap of stones is a house. And I like very much this citation because it has to do with what I say on this slide, which is one recommendation I would do to people doing theory is to read empirical papers. Sometimes when I discuss with theorists, I have the impression that they view, academia as being made of two, or they think there is a division of labor, basically. There is a division of labor between theorists who are just supposed to do theory and not think about how to test the theory, and empiricists whose business is precisely to think about methodologies to test the theory and so on and so forth. At a very high level, that's probably true, but in a field which is applied, like finance is applied. If you want to do theory, then you need to be on the top of, the empirical literature in your field and understand the variables that people use, the way they measure, some concepts that you are using, let's say adverse selection, for instance, the questions that they ask, the methodologies that they use. That's the only way, to develop interesting applied theory papers, I think. By definition, applied theory means you are going to use tools which are more fundamental that have been developed elsewhere in economics. So the likelihood that you make fundamental progress is very low. What you can do, and that's very, very useful and very valuable, is precisely, to use those tools to shed light on very interesting applied questions in your field. And so for this, you really need to understand, it's very important to spend time reading the empirical literature, even more so in finance that probably 85% of all published papers in the top journals are just empirical papers, maybe even more than that. So, the only way to publish 30 papers is to speak to empiricists, because if you have two referees, probably one of the two will be an empiricist. So you should, when you write papers in particular, theory papers in particular, it's very important to be clear on the predictions of the theory. Discuss, when the predictions are in line with what people have found in the past, but that's not sufficient. Also explain what are the new predictions. Now, the fact that predictions are in line is interesting, but not sufficient, because people can always reverse engineer, the data in a sense, and write the theories that are going to predict, what is found in the data. So it's much more interesting when you make predictions that have not been found in the data yet, that give the possibility to empiricists to test the theory in a sharp way. And then I will make, the symmetric recommendation. That is, if you are an empiricist, one good way to generate ideas is to read theoretical papers, because theoretical papers are about mechanism. Why is there an effect of X on Y, under which condition, which parameterization, and so on and so forth. And so if you're an empiricist, you are in the business of trying to measure the effect of X on Y, measure X, measure Y. So then if you want ideas, reading the theory is very good. And as well, I would say that increasingly, there is a lot of emphasis on the moment of identification, causality, and so on and so forth. So many empiricists, work very hard on identification, trying to find good setup to identify the effect of X on Y. But very often, they don't say why we should expect in the first place X to have a causal effect on Y. By which mechanism? I think this is very important. Knowing the size of an effect is important for policy, but knowing where the effect is coming from, I would argue, is even more important if you want to intervene. So it's very important to understand via which economic mechanism X may have an effect on Y, not just measure rightly the effect of X on Y. Okay, so what are the standard mistakes that I see? I think sometimes people submit papers too early. That's a mistake in finance. My experience is that the papers that go through are very polished right from the start. I have the impression, that the one reason why people do that is that requirements are not exactly the same across fields. I have the impression that in economics, especially for top journals, people may tend to submit papers which are not as polished, and the culture maybe is to leave, to referees and editors to provide more guidance about what to keep in the paper and so on and so forth. That's not the case in finance. As I was mentioning previously, people are not going to give guidance to authors, on how to write the paper. So if you don't submit right from the start a very polished paper, there is a chance that referees and editors will not understand what you want to say, and they will reject, simply because they don't get the point. It's to the authors to write in such a way that they can be understood. Another mistake that I see is that papers are too long and not very well organized. By that, I mean, in writing papers, it's very important to think about the flow of ideas. Ideas should come, should be linked up together in the paper in a logical way. That seems obvious, but sometimes, those logical links are not obvious in the paper. So people jump from one idea to a next, a test to a next test, and so on and so forth, without explaining clearly what are the linkages between those different tests or those different ideas. So that makes reading papers and understanding what authors want to say more difficult. Okay, so there is this issue with literature review that I already mentioned. Yeah, another thing I think is very important is that as scholars, you should seek and listen to feedback. So one way to get feedback before submitting papers is to present papers in brown bags, seminars, workshops, and so on and so forth. And if you do that, let's say if you do 5 presentations, typically you will get what I call sticky comments, that is comments that come back again and again. And if the comments come back again and again, you should address them before submitting the paper. That means you know that there is something in the paper that people don't understand well, or that people think you should address. So it's very likely that referees are going to have the same views. So you should really spend the time, addressing the sticky comments, not saying, sometimes people say, we will see what the referees want. I don't think this is a super good idea to wait for referees to make an opinion. And then, in case of rejection, I really advise that, of course, you should do that, if you are not rejected, that everybody understands. But even if you are rejected, you should spend time, carefully reading reports and ask yourself how you can address the main points. Not every point, but at least the main points. I mean, sometimes referees, when they write reports that lead to rejection, they still provide very, very valuable insight to the authors. In my case, for instance, I benefited a lot of rejection. I got rejected many times, but every time I really try, to understand what the referees, why the referees, did not get what I wanted to say. And that helped me a lot to write the paper before resubmitting the paper to another journal. Sometimes, this is not even a question of changing the theory or running new tests. It's a question just of clarity in the text. And I think, at least doing that can be very, very useful to pass the bar, basically. And also, you should realize that the pool of referees is small. So the chance that you are going to get the same referee if you submit to another journal is high. So if you don't address, the referee's comments when you resubmit to another journal, the referee is going to say, well, I don't change my mind. So that happened to me a lot. I mean, GFQA, I received many papers that have been submitted elsewhere before, and very often I contact, referees that have been referees for this paper already. And last thing, you should not give up. That is, I have seen many colleagues, over the last 30 years, giving up too early. That is, people tend to be discouraged by rejection. I think we should not. That's part of the game. So we should be tenacious, and we should keep trying. Basically, we should have realistic expectation. The bar for top journals is super high. The rejection rate is probably 90%, even more. A GFQA, we have a rejection rate of 92%. So, of course, that means I have to reject, for instance, among the 200 papers that I have every year, I reject most of the paper. Maybe 180 papers. That's a lot. And so as authors submitting their papers to those journals, they should just anticipate that the most likely outcome is going to be a rejection. Okay, data I think is becoming very important. The top journals have been changing their policy recently. A GFQA, we are about to change our policy and to have a code and data sharing policy. So this has some implications for authors. I think that when you start a project, ask yourself whether you will be able to share the data. One thing that, for instance, Journal of Finance is doing now is that they don't require the authors to share the data when they are private, but they ask the authors whether the provider of the data agrees with the use of the data for the paper. So that's important. Imagine that you get the data by scraping the internet, and you scrap the data from a private website. It's maybe that the provider of the data will not agree with publication. And so then you may have spent 3 or 4 years of your life working on something, and the paper might be forthcoming, and you cannot publish the paper simply because you don't have this authorization. So asking yourself whether you will not have problems on this side right from the start is very useful. That's different, from sharing private data. Here, this is not even that. This is just getting the authorization that you can use the data for publication, for writing a paper. Another thing that you need to do, because that's a requirement, is to prepare the code so that it can be run by someone without knowledge of your project. Increasingly, journals have data editors, and what data editors do is just to check whether for papers that have been accepted for publication, the code ran as it should do. And so very often what I have heard, I have a colleague, with running a third-party certification agency for that. And he told me that surprisingly, it's very difficult just to push a button and run the code to check that the code generates the tables that are supposed to be generated by the code. That's the problem. That means, and I guess this is a question of culture. People in our field, and again, that's my case, don't write code in a way that can be easily read by people with no knowledge of the project. So that's a question of discipline. And I think that for people who do empirical work, doing that in a clear way is going to be increasingly necessary. By the way, what I would suggest is that a good way, to check that everything is in order with the paper is to ask a third party to certify that your code is running well. Again, I have this colleague, Christophe Perignon at HEC, who has developed this certification agency, which is called Cascade, which is doing exactly that. And there are other agencies doing that, but that's one of them. And he has written a paper recently with other co-authors, it's on SSRN, this paper, where they provide some guidelines about how to prepare your code and your data in such a way that will make the job of someone in charge of reproducing, not replicating, just reproducing the tables with your code easy. Okay, and just to finish on that, I recently read a paper by Alex Edmans, which is on SSRN, Learning from 1,000 Rejections, about his experience as editor at the Review of Finance. I found it very, very useful. I mean, what he says in this paper is exactly my experience. I mean, all his recommendations are very, very useful, I think. There is a book in this case by Michael Westbar about going through from your PhD to being, to being a more senior, more seasoned professor, is providing a lot of insights about how to go through the publication process. It's a very good book, I think. I read, an early version of the book, and I will recommend that. So maybe at this stage I can take some questions. I was planning to talk a little bit about my research project, just as some ideas of research, but maybe at this stage it's better that I take questions.
Superb. Thank you so very much, Thierry, for all those very inspiring comments. So some questions from the audience, and then Thierry will speak us a bit about his personal research. So please raise your hands, the ones that you would like to make questions to Professor Foucault. Professor Godonikas here.
Hi there. It was an excellent presentation, and I was really interested in the part that you were talking about the ability to create a proper critical literature review in order to have a proper idea generation. So I would like to take us in the feet of a very young person, someone about to enter university. We have this ChatGPT, all this AI, we have people with limited attention, as we know, with young people with mobile phone screens, etc. So do you think there is a tension between all this AI and the ability of people to focus and to have the ability to proper do idea generation based upon critical literature reviews? I don't want to sound like a loser, but maybe there is a cost and a benefit. So where do you think this thing is going to be? And what would you advise, let's say someone who is 17 years old, is about to enter university, and he's going to be very tempted to use all this type of technology in order to help them write an essay, create a literature review, and so on?
You want me to answer no, or do I take other questions?
No, Thierry, you can answer to this question, then we can have more.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I mean, the effect of ChatGPT and AI on the academic publication process is still not very well understood. In fact, interestingly, Elsevier and the major publishers, OUP, they have issued some recommendations about how to use ChatGPT and so on and so forth. So if you go to their website, there are some discussions along the lines of your question. But for the moment, I think we're at the very beginning, so we don't understand yet very well the implications. My experience with ChatGPT is that it's very useful to increase your productivity in some cases. For instance, you can ask, you want to get some ideas about a paper very quickly. You can ask ChatGPT to summarize the paper or a book. You can ask ChatGPT to give you 5-6 papers on a topic and it will return the thing. So in terms of enhancing your productivity, I think that's probably a useful tool. No, I agree that people, especially young scholars, have to be very careful because ChatGPT is making many mistakes. For instance, I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of some influential papers in market microstructure. Some were right, some were completely wrong, basically. So I think, ChatGPT, it's a good tool when you have already a good knowledge of what you are doing. So I will not advise, to use ChatGPT to do a literature review if you are not aware of the literature already. If you are, then, that's a way to fine-tune, maybe catch papers you were not aware about and this type of thing. But certainly people have to be careful. And I'm a bit concerned that a more general problem is that we may have papers that are entirely written with AI. And there are books already that are entirely written with AI. So why not scientific papers? And there that will be another world. Yeah, one thing, by the way, for which this will be another world is that, as I was mentioning before, the flow of papers to a top journal is huge. And the ratio between papers and referees is deteriorating. There are more and more papers than referees and potential referees. So if we have papers that are written by machines, this imbalance is going to increase. And the problem is that we still need some people to be able to screen, to separate reasonable papers from papers that are not good at all. And so that's not going to help. Huh?
Hi Thierry, this is Manthos Delis from Audencia. Thanks much for an excellent presentation. Couple of questions actually. The first one is about which research topics you might be fancying in the years to come as an editor, in finance of course. And second point is talk to us a little bit about the psychology of the referees and the editors on that matter. I mean, there's a little bit of a variance there, especially when it comes to experience of the referees, and what is also the behavior of the editor when it sees a split decision, whether the editor takes matters into his own or her own hands, and all of that. Thank you much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So what are the big topics? Dimitrios asked me, to give a list of what I think are the big topics. It's a bit difficult for me because I tend to be biased by there are topics that I like, and so these are the one I know. But so, for instance, I think that everything which has to do with the effect of AI, artificial intelligence, and big data on financial markets is very important. And a very important function of financial market is to produce information in many ways. So you have many security analysts, rating agencies, markets themselves are machines to produce information. So given that, because AI is about forecasting and making decisions in an automated way, I expect, AI and big data to have very big effect on the financial industry. So I think we should have more and more research on that. I mean, there are two types of research. There are papers using the tools of AI to revisit traditional questions, like, for instance, trying to find predictors for factors for asset prices. That's one thing. In this case, researchers are consuming the techniques from AI to address questions. There is another line of research which consists in asking questions about the effect of those technologies on financial markets and how they change, for instance, traditional ways to get information, how they impact, the asset management industry, and so on and so forth. I think the second line of research is very important. I'm still a bit surprised that it's not yet that developed. I see, many papers using techniques from AI, especially in asset pricing, to find predictors and so on and so forth. That's natural. I don't see that many papers asking research questions about the effect of AI on corporate finance, market liquidity, this type of thing. So I think this is a big question. No, to come to your second question, my experience with, sometimes people have the impression that referee reports are very bad and so on and so forth. I must say that maybe, that's just me, but my experience with the reports I have seen, and I have seen many, at Review of Finance, ARAPS, Journal of Finance, GFQA, is that typically referees do a good job. I mean, there are some exceptions. I have seen terrible reports a few times. But in general, I must say that referees do their job seriously. So authors may disagree because sometimes, referees seem not to understand what the authors want to do. But as I was saying before, the onus is on the authors to explain well what they want to do. No, when referees are split, in general, at GFQA, I ask, very often we ask only one referee, but in my case, I tend to ask two referees sometimes, especially when these are papers a bit outside my area of expertise. It happens that they are split. When they are split, I read very carefully the paper, and here, it's not easy. That's always very difficult. And I think this is the tendency at Finance Journal. This is something that Bea mentioned as well. I tend to invite a revision only if I anticipate that there will be convergence. That is, in the past, there was a tendency to invite revision with no commitment at all. And that could last forever. Basically, you could have papers, going through 5 rounds, and then at the end, the editor will tell you, sorry, you are not going to publish your paper, which I think was very bad, because when you start revising the paper, you start giving an angle to the paper. So everything is changing, and you make changes that might be difficult to revert, or at least that will take time to revert to submit to another journal. So it's good, I think, that finance journals, at least, they have this sort of not, 100% commitment, but some commitment that if you are invited to revise the paper for the journal, there is a very good chance that if you do the revision properly, that it will go through. And so, for instance, when I do that, I'm also very careful in the second round, for instance, that referees do not come up with new questions, because that's not fair. I mean, you have the opportunity to read the paper in the first round as a referee, so you should ask all your questions this round. And if the authors do more or less what you have asked them to do, then you should not come up with new questions, because then this is a moving target. That's not fair. So given this commitment, sort of imply, contract, again, it's not a binding contract, but sort of an implicit agreement. I tend to invite a revision in case of a split only if I am quite confident that the authors will make it, basically, to the end. Otherwise, I prefer not to invite a revision, because it's just, I don't want to be in the situation of having to reject the paper after five rounds. That's not, again, the process is not there to help the authors to improve the paper. The process is there to screen papers. That's tough, but that's what it is. Even more with limited resources. The improvement is just, I would say, at the margin, just to make sure that that will be a good publication.
Thank you very much, Thierry. Do you know, before moving to your personal agenda and to make the floor for this, do you have to share with us any personal experience from one of your studies that had a strange journey, or the outcome was different from what you were expecting? I mean, from your own personal research, from your
Yeah, for instance, I'm not sure to understand fully your question, but for instance, I remember in my case, I had a paper, I first submitted the paper to, well, two experiences I'm going to share with you. I submitted my paper that was about 7 years ago, I think, to GFE, got feedback, and the paper was about the idea that arbitrage, in the traditional sense, can be a source of adverse selection, which I think is an interesting idea that was, for me, that was new. And so the paper was called Toxic Arbitrage. And we got a rejection from the referee, from the GFE. And the main point that the referee was making is, well, you know, we have known adverse selection for 30 years since Kyle. I say, yes, we know what is adverse selection, of course, but that's not the point of the paper. The point of the paper is that arbitrage can be a form of adverse selection. And in my opinion, that was the main message and that was new. But then, you know, when I read the report, I say, okay, now I understand. The referee was right. We did not explain in the right way what was the main message. And so I took this opportunity basically to rewrite the introduction and basically address directly the referee's points. I directly, you know, I wrote a sentence saying, yes, of course, adverse selection is well known, and there are many empirical papers showing that adverse selection is there in financial market, but that's not the point of the paper. And so, you know, in this way, basically, by learning from my experience with the GFE, I revised the paper that helped, you know, to get the paper published in the next round, the next step, and the paper eventually got published at the RFS. So you see, that's what I meant by you should learn from feedback, even when it is negative. Let me give you another experience, which is that slide, basically. But my very first paper, you know, it was very hard for me to publish the paper. I submitted to various journals, RFS, then got a rejection, well, got a revision, but then eventually a rejection. Then I submitted to the Journal of Finance. It went through 2 rounds, got a rejection. The referee thought the paper was interesting and so on. And then finally, I did not manage to publish the paper in a top journal, but I learned a lot in the process. And the paper went to the Journal of Financial Markets, which is a very good journal, high impact journal. And as of now, this is my paper which has received the most citations. And so I'm very happy with that. You know, I spent a long time with this paper trying to get it published. I learned a lot during the process. And I think I wrote something that had some impact. You know, that's my most, you know, cited paper so far. So that's again, you know, an experience where I learned a lot from negative feedback, in fact, just by spending time trying to understand what referees did not like or did not understand.
I see. Excellent. And let us come now to you speaking about your personal research. What are you doing now? What is the future?
Okay. Cool. So maybe I can reshare my slide,
yes,
if you wish. Let's see. Where? Okay. Just quickly, let me. Okay. So my recent research is very much about the effect of big data and artificial intelligence on information production in financial markets and decision making. So over the last 10 years, I've been working on the effect of algorithmic trading on financial markets and high frequency trading, but this was very much market microstructure. Recently, I stepped back a little bit and I took a broader view and I got financing from you to work on that. And so the idea is to try to understand how the emergence of big data in the context of finance, this means alternative data and AI, the use of AI to process those data and use this data for decision, is affecting financial markets. And so here I have I listed a few questions on which I have been working. One question is, how do alternative data, that is data from social media like Twitter and stock tweets, or geolocation data, or satellite images data, is affecting the quality of forecast about, let's say, for instance, future earnings or macroeconomic forecasts. So I have a paper with Laurent Frézard and Olivier Dessin, in which we show that with the emergence of alternative data, the quality of analyst forecast about earnings, about short-term earnings has improved. So that's not very surprising. People have access to more data, and so they are better able to forecast short-term earnings, especially because many analysts now are using techniques from artificial intelligence to process this data. But the more surprising finding, and that's the main point of the paper is forthcoming in the GF, is that at the same time, we see a negative impact on the quality of their long-term forecast, let's say beyond 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. And that part is surprising. So in the paper, what we do is that we develop a theory of why this may happen. Our theory is based on the question of attention and allocation of tasks between forecasting the short term and the long term. And then we test, this theory. We have some method, to identify the effect of alternative data on forecasting. But more broadly, what I think here there is an interesting general research agenda, which is how do big data affect investors' forecasting at various horizons? The literature on this tend to focus on forecasting, tend to focus in finance a lot on short-term forecasting, let's say earning forecast in the next year. And not so much, the very long run forecast that people can make, let's say, forecast in 4 and 5 years. I think that's a gap in the literature because there are many important decisions that firms have to make for the long run. If you think about the effect of climate change on the economy, and for instance, the type of decision that firms have to make to get protected against bad effect from climate change or to comply with regulation, many of the investments they have to make will pay off only in the long term. And we are relying on the stock market to compute the NPV of those investments. So if the stock market is not able to correctly forecast the very long term, it's unlikely that the stock market is going to be able to arrive to the right NPV for those investments, which may discourage firms for making the investment in the first place. So I have a second paper with Dessin and Frézard, where we look exactly at this question by using our findings in this paper on security analysis forecast. The second question on which I'm working at the moment is the effect of the rise of alternative data on active asset managers. As you know, there are two types of active asset managers that are always looking for information to try to forecast returns and earnings, to try to generate alphas. In the past, they were doing that in what people call discretionary way, that is using judgment and expertise to try to select, to pick stocks. Increasingly, they are using alternative data and quantitative methods. So over the last 20 years, there is a rise of quant funds, and so the proportion of quant funds among active asset managers has been increasing. And there is even a replacement of asset managers by quantitative asset managers. So on this topic, I'm working on two papers. One is forthcoming in the Journal of Finance. This is a one theory paper with Jérôme Dugard, where basically what we do is that we start from Grossman and Stiglitz as a model of information production. But in Grossman and Stiglitz, people are supposed to pay a cost to get a signal. We say, well, okay, there is, with the rise of alternative data, maybe this cost has decreased. Many people have made this assumption. We are not the first to say that. But there is another dimension, which is people have many more data sets to explore to find good signals. And so that is the new part of the theory. That is, we model the idea that there is an expansion in the set of data that people can use to find their signals. And so we model the effect of that on the performance of active asset managers, and maybe more importantly, on the allocation of capital between discretionary asset managers and quants. And so we get many findings, but maybe the most surprising finding that we get is that a rise in alternative data, when people have access to more and more data, that does not mean that the average quant asset manager is going to become better. In fact, in our model in equilibrium, it becomes worse. And at some point, what we find is that the allocation of capital to quants may stop, and you may even have a flow back of capital to discretionary investors. I will not enter into the details of the theory, but again, that's an idea of research. Basically, how does the big data revolution, how does it affect active asset managers? Another paper that I have on that with Maxime Bonelli at LBS. This is just an empirical paper where we look at the effect of the introduction of satellite images for retailers in the US. So basically, those are images, pictures of their parking lots, every day by a firm which is called Arithmetric. We look at what happens to the performance of active asset managers holding those stocks when those stocks become covered. And what we find, which at first glance is a bit surprising, we find that this performance is declining. So the emergence of alternative data is having a negative impact on the performance of the average active asset manager. And we provide an explanation for that. Our explanation is that the reason is that there are some people who get access to those data. Those people trade more intensively or get access to more precise signals, if you wish. They trade more intensively on those signals that make stock prices more informative. That's going to accelerate the decay of their alpha for more traditional asset managers. And that's exactly what we find in the data. And then last project on which I'm working, which I think is another interesting line of research in finance, is how do algorithms behave? Basically, increasingly, for instance, in the context of financial markets, trading and investment decisions are going to be made by algorithms, not by humans. Humans are going to code the algorithm, but they are not going to make the decision. So in a sense, we need a new type of behavioral finance. That is, we need models in which we think not about the behavior of humans, but the behavior of algorithms. So far, this has been very little done, for instance, in my field, in market microstructure. I mean, models of high-frequency market makers, for instance, they tend to see market makers, high-frequency market makers who are using algorithms, in fact, just have faster humans in the traditional models like Cal in 1985, for instance, faster in getting access to information. So here in my project with Jean-Edouard Colliard and Stefano Lobo at HFAA, we take a completely different approach. We say, what if prices are really set by algorithms that start with no knowledge of their environment and that learn, by experimenting? And so what we do in this paper, in this project, is very much like experimental economics. We put algorithms in a lab where they have to play a market-making game. They have to set prices for a risky asset. And we ask them to choose their prices by using a machine learning, reinforcement learning, the type of, method that has been used to play the game of Go or chess, developed by DeepMind and AlphaGo. And what we find very interesting things. We find that the algorithms are not bad, even though the methods are very different from the traditional approach in economics. They tend, to find prices which are not crazy, at which they make some profit on average. But they tend also to understand the notion of adverse selection, the risk of trading with better informed agents. They cover their cost of adverse selection, but they don't behave competitively. That is, the prices we observe, they deviate from competitive prices. We are not the first to find that. There are people who have found that, in other markets. But what we find, which we think is very interesting and specific to financial markets, is that when there is more adverse selection, that's good. That makes the algorithm more competitive. And so at the moment, what we try to do is to understand why this is the case by running additional experiments. But here, the more general message is that I think that thinking about or developing, a field which could be called algorithmic behavioral finance will be very interesting because that's very relevant. And it's not only in the context of trading that people use algorithms. For instance, for banks, for making loan decisions, increasingly they are going to rely on machines. So you have many areas in finance which are going to be impacted by machines. And so thinking about the behavior, the way machines make their decision, I think is going to become very important. And so that's the things on which I'm working. I can stop here if you wish.
Thanks a lot, Thierry. I think very interesting ideas as well for someone to start building on his research, what you have produced. I would like to ask the audience if there is any more question to Professor Foucault. Of course, not only me, not only everyone here, but I think those that are online in the YouTube and in Zoom, we would like to thank you very much, Thierry, for inspiring us today and for giving us food for continuing our research. Of course, the list that we can do as an organization is, what you can see, We are going to send you a plaque as appreciation for the work you have done for us today, as a memory of your presentation in Hellenic Finance and Accounting Association. And hopefully one day we will have you with us in Athens, Greece. I would like to wish to you, to your family, happy festive period, Merry Christmas, and a happy New Year 2024, productive and with many and excellent publications to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Thierry. Thank you very much. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ όλους για το φαγητό.
Καλησπέρα και από εμάς. Δεν θα σας καθυστερήσουμε πολύ. Κάθε χρόνο ο πρόεδρος του συνδέσμου δίνει τους επένους και τα βραβεία. Φέτος νομίζουμε ότι είναι η στιγμή να δώσουμε και εμείς ένα βραβείο στον πρόεδρο. Εκ μέρους λοιπόν του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου του Συνδέσμου Επιστημόνων Χρηματοοικονομικής και Λογιστικής Ελλάδος, ένα μεγάλο ευχαριστώ στον πρόεδρο, στον καθηγητή Χρήστο Νεγκάκη, για τη συνεισφορά του στο σύνδεσμο και τη συνεισφορά του στην επιστήμη χρηματοοικονομικής και λογιστικής.
Ναι, γι' αυτό και έκατσα έτσι. Λοιπόν, δύο λόγια από καρδιάς, δεν θα σας καθυστερήσω καθόλου. Μιλάμε για έναν άνθρωπο που ξεκίνησε, οργάνωσε, έτσι. Έφερε κοντά όλους εμάς, νεότερους, ακόμα νεότερους, μεγαλύτερους, σε ένα ιστορικό πλέον συνέδριο. Τον ευχαριστούμε από καρδιάς. Ξέρουμε πόσο ανοιχτός είναι σε καινούργιες ιδέες, σε καινούργια πρόσωπα, ώστε να δουλέψουν για τον σύνδεσμο. Εγώ περνάω πάρα πολύ καλά προσωπικά σε αυτό το συνέδριο. Ελπίζω το ίδιο να συμβαίνει και εσάς. Ερχόμαστε εδώ, ανταλλάσσουμε απόψεις. Είναι ο άνθρωπος που επί της ουσίας το συνέλαβε ως κόνσεπτ και το υλοποιεί κάθε χρόνο. Τον ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ από καρδιάς του. Το είπα και προσωπικά χτες. Ήρθε η ώρα να το βραβεύσουμε κι εμείς. Χρήστο μου, σε ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Ή και το δώρο συμβολικό είναι πένα. Είναι ακόμη πιο συμβολικό για ακαδημαϊκό και φίλο. Εγώ από καρδιάς ευχαριστήσω όλους. Ξεκινήσαμε μια απλή ιδέα, σήμερα είμαστε πάρα πολλοί. Ευχαριστώ όλους τους συναδέλφους. Τώρα μπορώ να πω πολλά ονόματα. Θα πω εδώ τον Νίκο Σοβαφέσκα που τον είδα πήγε θα έρθει, ο οποίος έρχεται μόνο για μας. Θα μας κάνει και ένα ωραίο δώρο ο Ανδρέας. Τώρα θα δώσω το μικρόφωνο στον Ανδρέα. Τώρα είστε πάρα πολλοί. Τον Νίκα, Φλόρ, όποιο και να πω, είστε πάρα πολλοί. Σας ευχαριστώ. Είναι πάρα πολλοί από πίσω. Είναι πολλά παιδιά κρεμασμένα και στο Zoom και στο YouTube, που και αυτούς επίσης σας ευχαριστώ. Και θα ήθελα μια χάρη από όλους τους παλιούς να βοηθήσουμε τα νέα παιδιά. Ξεκινήσαμε αυτή την ιδέα το 2000. Δεν μπορούσαμε να βρούμε ένα καθηγητή τότε για να το στηρίξουμε, με τον Ανδρέα. Να είναι καλά ο κύριος Στομαδάκης. Τον είπα, αλλά έχει COVID, γι' αυτό δεν είναι εδώ. Πρώτος είπε, θα βάλουμε πλάτη. Μετά ο συγχωρημένος ο Ξανθάκης. Και σήμερα είμαστε 700 άτομα. Έλληνες και πολλά παιδιά από το εξωτερικό. Και πιστεύω αυτή η ιδέα για να συνεχίσει πρέπει να βοηθήσουμε, να στηρίξουμε τα νέα παιδιά και κάποια στιγμή να το συνεχίσουν τα νέα παιδιά. Σας ευχαριστώ όλους. Θα ήθελα λίγο να δώσω το μικρόφωνο στον Αντρέα να μας κάνει ένα ωραίο δώρο, μια και είναι γιορτές.
Thank you, Χριστό, και συγχαρητήρια. Πραγματικά το αξίζεις και είμαι πολύ περήφανος για σένα και για όλη την ομάδα που κάνετε τρομερή δουλειά. Έρχομαι τα τελευταία χρόνια και είμαι με τις καλύτερες εντυπώσεις και συγχαρητήρια σε σένα και σε όλους εδώ και ειδικότερα σε όλους που συμμετέχουν σε αυτό το συνέδριο. Είχα μιλήσει ψες με τον Χρήστο και του είπα ότι το International Journal of Accounting, το οποίο είναι ένα από τα leading journals του accounting, σύμφωνα με το APS είναι 3-star. Είμαστε πολύ περήφανοι λόγω της ποιότητας των μελετών που παρουσιάζονται εδώ στο συνέδριο, να μας στείλει τις 5 καλύτερες που πιστεύει η ομάδα εδώ, και ο Χρήστος και οι υπόλοιποι, ο Μάνθος, η Κική και η Επιστημονική Επιτροπή, να μας στείλει τα 5 καλύτερα papers που πιστεύουν και θα τα πάρουμε fast track, θα τα αναλάβω εγώ, το International Journal of Accounting, το οποίο το είχε αναλάβει εδώ και πάρα πολλά χρόνια ο Ρασάτ. Τώρα το έχει δώσει σε 3 άλλους. Είμαστε 3 senior editors. Εγώ στο Market-Based Accounting Research. Ο Tom Omer που ήταν και editor του Accounting Review κάποτε, τώρα είναι editor στο Auditing. Και ο Ira Solomon που είναι στο Taxation, που είναι στο University of Illinois για το Urbana-Champaign. Το journal δημοσιεύεται από το University of Illinois για το Urbana-Champaign. Τα περισσότερα papers τα παίρνουμε στο Market-Based Accounting Research, τα οποία θα αναλάβω εγώ προσωπικά, Χρήστο, και να μας στείλετε τα 5 και θα πάνε fast track. Αυτά τα 5 papers θα πάνε φυσικά through review process και ευελπιστούμε ότι σύντομα, αν είναι καλά papers στο επίπεδο το οποίο πραγματικά θέλουμε και πιστεύω θα είναι, θα πάνε fast track για δημοσίευση. Το θετικό όσον αφορά το International Journal of Accounting, τον τελευταίο καιρό εκείνο το οποίο κάνουμε, πάνε τα papers through review process, έχουμε senior editors 3, έχουμε πολύ καλούς editors και εκείνο το οποίο κάνουμε, δίνουμε στους editors περίπου 30 με 40 μέρες του respond. Σε 2 μήνες οι περισσότεροι παίρνουν το editorial decision. Άρα υπολογίζεται 2 με 2,5 μήνες θα έχετε το editorial decision, νομίζω ένα μεγάλο πλεονέκτημα. Παίρνουμε αρκετά papers κάθε χρόνο, καμιά 400 papers, όχι 1.300 όπως το HFAA που μας έχουν πει προηγουμένως. Και θέλουμε να πάρουμε και από εσάς πολύ καλά papers και σας υποσχόμαστε ότι αυτά τα papers θα πάνε through regular review process και εύχομαι να δημοσιευτούν. Θα μας στείλετε τα καλύτερα papers και θα τα αναλάβω εγώ, ούτως ώστε να προσπαθήσουμε να έχουμε και papers από αυτό το conference και εύχομαι, Χρήστο, να τα έχουμε κάθε χρόνο αυτά τα papers, ούτως ώστε να δώσουμε και εμείς, βάλουμε και εμείς το δικό μας λιθαράκι στην ανάπτυξη της επιστήμης, της λογιστικής και χρηματοοικονομικών. Σε ευχαριστώ και συγχαρητήρια.
Ένα δωράκι μικρό.
Σε ευχαριστώ, φίλε.
Κλείνοντας, θα τιμήσουμε και έναν αφανή. Ξεκινήσαμε με το 2000. Τώρα βέβαια έχουμε, να μου επιτρέψετε χωρίς παρεξήγηση, έχουμε αρκετή δύναμη πλέον από όλες τις απόψεις. Τότε δεν είχαμε. Έχουμε 23 χρόνια έναν αφανή ήρωα, που είναι η έδρα μας. Είναι και ο οικονομικός μας σύμβουλος και ο φορολογικός μας σύμβουλος. Τηρούμε εκεί τα πάντα τα αρχαία. Είναι ο κύριος Ηλίας Μίτσιο. Έλα, Ηλία, εδώ. Είναι ο αθόρυβος τηλοβάτης του Συλλόγου και τιμή Σένεκεν, μετά από 23 χρόνια συνεχής συνεισφοράς, εκτιμώ ότι αξίζει ένα έτσι μια μικρό δωράκι. Σας ευχαριστώ όλους και σας εύχομαι ολόψυχα καλές γιορτές. Να είστε καλά.